Welcome to Trinity Radio. Thanksgiving is over, and now it's time to focus on other things. Like what I'm focusing on right now in Australia, evangelism, reaching others for the Lord Jesus Christ. You ought to be thankful that someone was thinking that way before you, or else you would have never come to know him. I'm Braxton Hunter, and this is
Trinity Radio, but I'm Jonathan Pritchett.
And today we're talking about how to present a cumulative case apologetic approach. So
It's not heresy. It's
it's Harrison.
Wow! They gave us nothing but tradition and no argument. All they did was get on this stage, yell real loud, and set a straw man on fire.
Okay, now I was not impressed. I've never heard of this gentleman before, but...
And there is no evidence at all, except in the imagination of Dr. Braxton and like-minded thinkers, that there is such a thing as an objective morality.
All right, well, that was a very passionate speech by Professor Alvarez. However, let me point out a couple of things that I have not argued tonight that Professor Alvarez seems to think that I have argued.
Everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence.
On behalf of humanity, God became man to die for the sin of the world. Then, because of that sacrifice, you can rise from the dead just like he rose from the dead.
Normal apologetics, when you said cumulative case, right? This is what I think of as normal apologetics.
Okay.
Let me explain why. Cumulative case apologetics is a method in which you take random things about the world. Well, not random, that's the wrong word.
You could.
Random things about the world, or mutually understood things about the world that everyone agrees on. There's a world, for example. That's one thing. You exist in it, I exist in it. We fall in love, we seem to make choices. People seem to have religious experiences. People seem to think there's things that are beautiful and not. Things like that. There's just facts about the world that people generally agree on. And you start drawing upon these things, and you give an account from your worldview that best explains all of this. And you may talk to other people and see what they think best explains all of this different kind of phenomenon. Right? And the reason why I call that normal apologetics is because normal people can do this very well if they understand the world that they live in.
Yeah.
Just if you're... Why does pollination with plants and bees and flowers, and why does all that work the way it works, just anything about the world, and give an explanation for it.
Yeah.
And see what other people's explanation for it. And it's perfectly reasonable and normal, I think, for you to have a conversation about the weather, right?
Yeah.
So you can have a conversation about love. You can have a conversation about religious experience. You can have a conversation about work.
Or you could be coming out of, I always use this as an example, although it's a little dated now. You remember that film, The Adjustment Bureau?
Yeah.
It had all to do with free will and were you controlled and all these kind of things. And you could have come out of that film and you'd be set up for a conversation with someone about, hey, do you believe free will is a real thing? Or do you think that everything is just kind of determined to happen the way it is? And that sets you up to talk about that and whose worldview accounts for free will the best. So those are kind of anything, like you said, anything. I think you could have said random. You could select randomly things to talk about. Because anything you talk, I think it was G.K. Chesterton said this, but something, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like this. Anything you talk about, whether it's pigs or rocks or auto mechanics, for long enough, you'll get back to God.
Yes.
And that's kind of the idea that cumulative case is based upon.
You'll get back to even Jesus. You can make a signpost to Jesus from anything, I think.
Okay.
Not just God, but Jesus as well.
Now, how does cumulative case apologetics, before we do it, how is it different than other forms of apologetics? Well, when I'm presenting at a conference, usually I'll present in my breakout sessions two different ways to use apologetics for evangelism, because we're interested in evangelistic apologetics. This is not just for your own mental amusement. This is to reach people with the message of the gospel.
Well, we're interested in two things: evangelistic apologetics and discipleship apologetics.
Yeah, that's right. That's my DMN project.
But what we do like is for Christians to share their faith.
Yeah.
And we do like for people to get saved.
And as Mark Middleburg says, evangelism in the 21st century is spelled apologetics.
Right, and he's right.
Partly, yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily always the case, but it's very helpful. So
and everybody is so mad that Braxton Hunter wrote the book that they can't write the book now.
Yeah.
Because he popularized it. Because you know what?
Well, thank you.
In addition to being an apologist with a PhD, he's also a loudmouth, leather-lunged preacher, evangelist.
Yeah, working on a DMN.
Yeah.
So, but when I'm presenting, I present two ways to do evangelistic apologetics. The first, when you're in the field of evangelism, so if you go to school and you take an evangelism class in seminary, what you'll learn is there are two different ways. I think it's Alvin Reed that popularized this, but there are two ways to do it. There is single encounter apologetics. That's where I'm sitting on a bus stop and I've got a friend next to me that I've just met. He's not a friend. I've just met him and don't know him. And I've got one conversation, or maybe we're on a bus together. We've got one conversation. And so I want to try to reach him right then as best I can, which is already very difficult when you include apologetics in that. But that's called single encounter apologetics. Right. Then you have multiple.
Hey, wait a minute. You're telling people they should actually talk to strangers about Jesus?
Yeah. It goes.
That's
for
a
me,
thing?
it should go without saying. And if it doesn't, that's a problem.
It actually, in our culture, I think that a lot of people don't think to actually talk to strangers about Jesus. I think they can talk to their family and their friends. Actually, I think you have better, more fruitful conversations with complete strangers than with family. But
you should do both. But yeah,
right, I agree. But I don't think people naturally think of I'm standing in the supermarket. I'm going to stare at my iPhone instead of talk to the person in front of me about Jesus.
Yeah, one of the things that I say when I preach on this issue is, and I want to get back to multiple encounter versus single encounter, but one of the things I say that you're kind of saying now is that when the world is more interested in reaching people with what they've got than we are with what we've got. So take Pepsi, for example.
That's a good line.
Yeah, they are. But if you take Pepsi, for example, Pepsi, when they got their new product of Pepsi, that to my taste buds feels like they ripped off a Coke and added more sugar to. And let's just imagine that Pepsi, after they did all of their test groups and all of their focus groups, they determined that only Australian people were going to be interested in Pepsi Cola. Now, this is not what happened, but let's just imagine. And so they were only going to allow it to be bottled in Australia. They were only going to use Australians in their advertising. They were only going to sell it in Australia. Would Pepsi be the multi-billion-dollar household name that it is today? Obviously not. Nope. What did they do? They took that first shot of Pepsi that they ripped off Coke and added more sugar to, and they said, everybody needs a Pepsi. You can't be the wrong color for a Pepsi. You can't live on the wrong continent for a Pepsi. You can't speak the wrong language for a Pepsi. Everybody needs a Pepsi. In other words, the whole world is their prospect. Not all kinds of people, like the whole world, every individual is their prospect.
That wasn't a subtle dig, was it?
Okay, I'm just saying. Okay, but we're not that way. As you just elucidated, Dr. Pritchett, we are interested in reaching one kind of person with the gospel, if we're interested at all. Most Christians that are interested at all in reaching people are interested in one kind of person. So, well, which kind of person is that?
Humans.
Well, it's different for different people. Some of us are only willing to witness to someone if they're the same color as us. Some of us are only willing to witness to someone if they're not the same color as us because we're on a mission trip on the other side of the planet. Some of us are only willing to witness to someone if they're inside our family, like our own sons or daughters. Some of us are only willing to witness to someone if they're outside of our family because we don't want to offend someone that's inside of our family. But when you get down to where the rubber meets the road, one thing is the same for all of us. It's the same person in this sense. We're all willing to witness to the kind of person that it's comfortable for us to witness to, and it almost never is. And as a result, we almost never do it, which is a big, big problem. So you've just got to, as a Christian, live with the fact that you're not being fed to lions, so it's okay to have an awkward conversation as your sacrifice for the Christian faith occasionally.
Yeah.
Right? Okay,
wow.
so...
That really puts the whole thing in perspective. Good job, man.
Well,
that really you're not being eaten by lions, so your sacrifice is having awkward conversation.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, how spoiled are we?
Yeah.
You know? I was reading the martyrdom of Polycarp, and wow, that moved me to my soul.
Oh, yeah.
What an amazing account.
Yeah.
And, and to think about all of the descriptions that were pretty vivid of what martyrs were suffering before it got to his martyrdom, it's so. And then there are people on the other side of the world who are being have executed and their heads chopped off for their faith, and we think it's too high a price to have an awkward conversation.
Right.
That should smack you if it doesn't.
Right. So
You should go out and find someone to have an awkward conversation
Yes.
with right now.
we live for awkward conversations.
They won't chop your head off.
So, okay.
Not here in America.
So multiple encounter evangelism versus single encounter. Multiple encounter is when you're going to see this person regularly for a while, and so you maybe work in the same office, you get together to watch a sporting event, whatever. And so whenever you're with them, you have more opportunity now to hit them with some more stuff. Now, as a loudmouth, leather-lung, red-faced preacher,
I forgot the red face. You should have corrected
I
me.
do find myself wanting to be the guy that kicks the door in on the burning building and runs in and grabs someone screaming and crying out of the building. You need to get saved today because you're not promised the next breath in your lungs. We don't know what tomorrow may bring. All that stuff. However, for some people, the worldview is a little more dug in than that. And though the gospel can accomplish that in one meeting, sometimes with apologetics, it takes a little longer. So you've got multiple encounter and single encounter. My theory is, or my approach is, that this cumulative case, I don't call it that when I'm doing a breakout, I call it a conversational approach. That, you call it the normal approach, I like that. That's good for single encounter. It would also be good for multiple encounter, but I use it for single encounter. And then for multiple encounter apologetics, I think that a classical approach is good because you have more time over weeks or months.
Or you can weave that into your overall.
You can use that, in both. And here's the differentiation, if it hasn't sunk in. A classical apologetics approach, a la J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, people like that, Norman Geisler, Frank Turek. What's going on there is it is a cumulative case in the sense that they're not going to use just one argument. They're going to use several lines of reasoning to get you to understand that this is reasonable to accept. However, and that's what's going on with the cumulative case. The difference is that in a classical approach, each individual argument usually is a standalone that you're willing to defend to the hilt. In other words, when Craig brings the Kalam cosmological argument, he's saying, you're not going to defeat this argument, and no matter what you bring up, you don't have another better explanation than this. With cumulative case, what we're willing to say is we may not defend each piece to the hilt. We just say, like some of those things that you threw out a while ago, you could throw in the rapid expansion of the early church, the existence of the New Testament today, the fact that everyone from philosophers to beggars on the street believe, these are all facts that need to be accounted for. Now, we're not saying those are arguments that we're going to defend. We're just throwing out pieces of data, just little data points that we think makes better sense on a Christian worldview than it does on any other worldview. So we're not, and they're going to have an explanation. The skeptic will have an explanation of their own, but it's just not. Then we do worldview analysis and say, what did I say?
You said skeptic.
Oh, let me say that. Skeptic can mean one of several things. Yeah. Some people, when they say skeptic, they mean agnostic. Some people when they say skeptic, they mean atheist. Some people, when they say skeptic, they mean anyone who is skeptical of the Christian faith. Right. That's how I'm using it here, just because you got to say something. Yeah, you can say unbeliever. Okay, so good point to make. And then what you do is, since they've got an explanation and you've got an explanation, you do worldview analysis and you use what is called abductive reasoning to do. Abductive reasoning is inference to the best explanation. So between these two worldview explanations for a piece of data, or for all the data, what is most plausible? What makes the best sense? What's most likely to be true?
Now, when we talk about these different methods, classical, cumulative case, or whatever you want to call it, there's a 5 views book out there, You and I are more of, let's take the best from various, I don't have it on my shelf.
Okay.
It's not that great of a book.
I love it. I think it's a great book.
Well, I mean, it's
A necessary book.
Yes, I think a newer one could be. I don't think that various things about it were. Anyway,
a newer book would be too provocative because now there is more obvious of a debate that is more red meaty between classicalist, evidentialists in general, and presuppositionalists.
Yeah, because I was going to say I'm a little bit more sympathetic to presuppositionalism than you are. Mm-hmm. I'm not very sympathetic to most practicing presuppositionalists because you've heard me rant about them. Most of them are annoying, but you can weave it. Presuppositional apologetics helps in this sense. If you can show where somebody else's account is actually borrowing from your line of credit, so to speak, that's helpful. And that's where presuppositionalism can be helpful in this sort of cumulative case apologetics. The difference is, like he said, you're not trying to defend to a hilt, so you don't have to be a jerk like presuppositionalists.
Okay, wait.
And you don't have to try to win every point, but at some point, there's what Dr. Kevin Lewis calls juridical apologetics. It's similar to cumulative case, where you make the standard the preponderance of evidence, right? And after you have all of these different things, you say, where is the preponderance of evidence? Is it your worldview and mine? And presuppositionalism can help you show where they're actually more.
They're borrowing capital from.
They're borrowing capital from you, but you don't do it in a way that most.
We're going to lose people. We're going to lose people. I just get this spidey sense when we're doing this. Okay, so
the hair on the top of your head stands up, right?
Right. Well, I'm gonna quickly lay out the different views real quickly. There are 5 general views that we usually talk about. Classical apologetics, which is what I pretty well consider myself to be a classical apologist.
Natural theology.
Classical apologetics shows, number 1, that God exists. Usually, then number 2, that Jesus is divine or that Jesus rose from the dead. Usually, Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so it's a 2-step method. And I want you to maybe, after I explain these 5, pause it and go back and listen again if you're not familiar. Classical approach, number 1, God exists. You show arguments for that. Number 2, God raised Jesus from the dead.
And classical arguments are typically arguments from nature in some sense or another.
Yeah, philosophy. Nature.
Philosophy and nature. Well, the Kalam is nature, natural world. It's arguing for the beginning of it.
Yeah.
Now it has philosophical defenses.
But then you got a moral argument. That's not exactly.
But that's transcendental.
Yeah. But anyway, let's keep it simple. So then evidential apologetics. Now this is a little tricky because sometimes people just refer to anything that's not presuppositional, which I'm going to explain down here in a minute, as evidential. So that they call classical evidential. But specifically, when we say evidential apologetics, when we're talking about the 5 views, evidential apologetics is the same thing as classical, except where I said this was a 2-step method, and here is God's existence, and then here's the resurrection. Break this piece off and throw it away. That's all the difference is. So with classical apologetics, like I said, you got J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, Norman Geisler, people like that, Frank Turek. With evidential apologetics, you got people like Gary Habermas, Michael Icona, people like that. Okay, just showing that Jesus rose from the dead. Then number 3 is you've got cumulative case, and I've kind of already described that. You're throwing out a lot of different little pieces of data, and then you're showing how those, the best explanation, you're doing worldview analysis with someone, show that the best explanation for all this data.
We would put Don Johnson. Older would be Josh McDowell.
Douglas Gruthouse?
Yeah. Is Sean McDowell, would you consider him?
I don't know. I think Ravi Zacharias would be. I think C.S. Lewis would be.
Yeah.
I think these are evidential or cumulative case apologists. Okay, and we're going to go into more detail about it because it's the thing we're talking about today. Then you got presuppositional apologetics. Presuppositional apologetics says, okay, everybody has presuppositions that they bring to the table when they're going to discuss or investigate or talk about worldview issues. The presuppositionalist, instead, so where everybody else, everybody that I've discussed prior, starts with, here's where we and the skeptic agree down here, evidentially. We agree on these facts about the way the world is, and so we reason up to God's existence. The presuppositionalists start up here and they presuppose the God of the Bible as the one true God.
And you can't get anywhere else without it.
Yeah, and then they want to point out...
every worldview requires God to exist to even exist, and that means they're false.
Yeah, so for example, you atheists try to reason that God does not exist, and they say you can't even have those reasoning capacities if God does not exist as the explanation for how you're able to reason.
Right.
So Cornelius Van Til said the atheist is like a little girl sitting in her daddy's lap to be able to slap his face. If the lap wasn't there, you wouldn't be able to get up to slap his face, right? So anyway, I know that some of these are weighty concepts, and you can research them further on your own, but there's a big debate that the evidentialists don't care nearly as much about as the presuppositionalists about these methodologies. Right. And then there's another one called Reformed epistemology, and I've explained that in previous videos, but frankly, this is enough for now. Okay, I'm not. Okay, Reformed epistemology just wants to point out that you can have reasonable justified warrant to believe something without external evidence. Okay, so
arguments,
yeah. That
you're just fine believing it.
Yeah, you have something in you similar to Calvin's. Calvin thought there may be a sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine in the mind of a man it's stronger in certain people than others, but they have this awareness of God that's natural. And so Reformed epistemologists kind of grab onto that, and they're like, yeah, that probably is this innate sense that God exists, and that's enough for you to believe.
And they think that apologetics, everything else is dumb or a waste of time.
Well, they're not...
Yeah,
as harsh about it as presuppositionalists are.
There was a book that you had.
I mean, Alvin Plantinga has done a lot of work in theistic arguments, and he's the flag bearer for Reformed epistemology.
But that's the thing: you get a flag bearer, and then people take it to the 10th degree and go crazy with it.
That's true.
So it becomes a weird, Frankenstein.
So, but to go over it again: classical apologetics, two-step approach. God exists. God raised Jesus from the dead. Evidentialist, one-step approach, God raised Jesus from the dead. The resurrection evidence. Cumulative case, bunch of facts and data about the world, and we reason that the best worldview that makes sense of that is Christianity. Yeah. Presuppositionalism, we presume...
You need God for everything else, so you believe in God because you do anyway. That's presuppositionalism.
Right, and
Reformed epistemology is, you're good.
Okay. All right. So not that that's what you're saying to an unbeliever, but to the believer who doesn't have external reasons to believe.
And this is dangerous because it gives church folk, oh, good, we don't have to deal with this.
Right. So actually, in my book, Evangelistic Apologetics, I argue that it could be helpful in talking with people in hospice care or nursing home, or people that don't have a lot of education. They're at the end of their life. Don't expect that we're going to be able to do a lot of rigorous philosophical work in such a case. And so if there's something in them that seems to indicate to them, I want to believe, I don't have...
Yes, Braxton Hunter, finding the good in everything.
Okay, so, all right.
Yeah, like a true apologist, you even say at least one thing nice about presupposition, and I know you don't like it as much.
I held back a torrent of things I wanted to say.
Yes, but there are some valid uses of it.
Sure.
Your problem is my problem. If you're not, Greg Bonson, don't do it.
Okay.
Because you're terrible, and nobody cares.
So,
and you always lose.
Or Dylan Simmons, Trinity graduate who uses it.
But no, he's like me. He incorporates it in with his other stuff to win it, but he's not a jerk.
Right. And some presuppers do that. They use arguments and reason and stuff. And I mean, most of them use the tag argument. So, but anyway, all right. So now let's back off and let's say cumulative case. We've explained everything. Pull it all aside. Bring cumulative case into view. Cumulative case then can be thought of this way. So if classical apologetics with its big arguments and all that fancy stuff is like giving you big, beautiful portraits, okay, that are complete pictures and saying, look at these beautiful portraits. All right, what cumulative case is like a mosaic. You know what a mosaic is? It's like all these little tiles, and each individual one doesn't necessarily give you the full picture. But when you put like 200 of them together and fit them all together, you get like Jesus, a picture of Jesus or something. Okay, so there you've got. That's
one of the best mosaics I've ever seen was the Star Wars poster or an image of all the characters from Star Wars that was made from stills from the Star Wars movies.
Oh, that's
The
pretty
original
good.
yeah,
That's pretty good. So that's that. Or you could think of a tapestry. A tapestry is a picture made out of thread and stuff, a big rug or whatever. And each individual thread is like a data point, a piece of data, a fact that we're going to talk about.
And it does look messy on one side, but if you turn it around, it's very beautiful.
But all the threads together make up the picture. So the point is, any one of these things may or may not really stand on its own. Okay, that's the difference between classical and cumulative case. All right, so I'm going to show you how to use. So some of the facts we've already discussed: free will. Why do we consider things beautiful? It seems like there's an objective standard for beauty or something. Morality. There's some overlap here. Morality, migratory patterns of butterflies, pollination. These are all just facts about the world that make more sense. But like I said, even the rapid expansion of the early church, that seems like maybe they saw something like a resurrection, things like this. All these things go together. Nature of free will. All right. Now, here's the method now. What I'm going to do now is give you a method for having a discussion with a skeptic, an unbeliever of whatever worldview. But since we can't talk about all worldviews in this podcast, we're just going to use atheism. Okay?
Boo.
So
the least likely person that you're going to meet is an atheist, unless you're on the internet, which you should do this off the internet and have an awkward conversation.
Yeah.
It's not awkward on the internet because everyone's,
Okay, so here we go. So the first thing you want to do, and again, you can do this with any worldview. So just notice as we walk through it how that would be or how that would look. Okay, so step number one is you're in conversation. You're just having you're on campus. You just came out of a class, or you're gone to a movie, or you're at a restaurant, or whatever, and you say to the person something like, "What? Hey, we've talked a lot about this. I want to understand your worldview. So how do you answer the big questions of life?" Okay, now that's what you want to ask them. Here's what's great about this. First of all, you're going to let them do most of the talking, because most of these people who are not Christians have been listening to a bunch of preachers preach at them all the time, and Christian friends preach at them all the time, and they've been waiting for someone to shut up and let them say something, and you're going to give them that opportunity, and you're really going to listen. So you want to ask them, how do you answer the major questions of life? Now, there's actually a reason for this. Because you say, well, you already told us they're an atheist. Okay, and they may have told you, well, I'm an atheist. But the thing is, these labels can mess things up, because there's a bunch of different kinds of Muslims, there's a bunch of different kinds of Mormons, there's a bunch of different kinds of atheists. There are naturalistic atheists, there are non-naturalistic atheists, there are people that believe in like Buddhist kind of spiritual stuff that call themselves Buddhists, but they're atheists. These labels can be confusing. So what we want to do is we want to find out specifically. And the way you do that is don't ask them for a label. Ask them how they answer the big questions of life. Because what you're going to notice in steps 1 and 2 is we want to prevent talking past each other. You know what talking past each other is? When you're responding to a worldview that they actually don't hold, and they're doing the same thing to you. No, we want to impact. So that's what we want to do.
And you want to actually at least pretend to be interested in what they say.
Now that's interesting you say that.
But you should be interested.
Because
you really should be. You should invest in people, but at least pretend to be interested.
When I do this as a breakout session...
Don't be like Braxton when I'm talking and he sits there and looks off camera like this.
I don't do that for the first 20 minutes of what you say. But when I haven't gotten to talk in a while, I start getting bored.
Okay.
Besides, you've been looking that way for part of this podcast.
No, I have not.
Okay, all right, here we go. So whenever I do this as a breakout session,
this is what it looks like.
All right. So whenever I do this as a breakout session, I always point out that I spend the first 15 minutes of the discussion talking about evangelism and how you should be using good evangelism techniques. And one of those evangelism techniques is you should be interested in what they have to say. And in order to be, you can't fake that. And whatever so I had someone say in Austin, they raised their hand and they said, "So are we supposed to fake it?" And everyone else in the place looked at them like in shock, because what the guy didn't realize was he kind of let
He has to
out that
preach
he
it,
doesn't
Christian.
care. And I'm like, no, you should care. Like you should, if you don't care about people, if you're not interested in what they believe so that you can help them with that, then don't do this, right? You should be doing that. You're doing this because you love people.
Right.
All right. Unless you think it's all going to be sorted out one way or the other and you're just going through the motions. Anyway, so...
Another subtle dig.
So, see, that's how you got to do it. You got to put it in there in a way that, unless it's pointed out...
No. Our Calvinist friends love to evangelize at a level with people because they want to see if they are the means by which God uses for that particular elect person to come
Right.
realize it.
That's true.
So,
Look at you, taking up for the Calvinists.
yes.
And they're very evangelistic.
I'm taking up for Calvinists because I never do. so I need to put some in the other column for a while. You know?
Yeah.
But it's good that you make the digs for me because I'm like secretly...
Just teeing you up.
Because
you wanted to say all that, but
Yes.
Okay. All right. So here's the deal. So step one is you ask them how do they answer the major questions of life. Now, so let's take the atheist as an example. What he's going to say, and again, they could say a lot of things, but one thing that they might say, here's the big questions. Number one, you want to ask them, how did we get here? Like human beings, how do we get here? Number two, what's the purpose or meaning of life if there is one? And number three, what happens when we die? So how are they going to respond to these things? Well, an atheist might say, well, how do we get here? Well, I don't know. The universe began to exist somehow, and matter coalesced in the stars, and then, galaxies formed, abiogenesis occurred, first life, more complex organisms, and here I am today.
So theology geeks, protology, teleology, and eschatology. Those are the three categories you talk to people.
Yeah. Yes. So that's how they're going to answer point one. Premise, or the second, it's not a premise. The second question, what's the purpose of life if there is one? Yeah. A consistent skeptic, atheist might say something like a Sartian kind of answer, like, well, there isn't really a point, like metaphysically a point, but you just kind of make up for yourself whatever purpose you want to have. And then what happens when we die? Well, you just die and that's it. Okay, that's life. And then that your nutrients go into the ground after your body decomposes and a tree grows from that, and then a Christian cuts you down and prints the Bible on your behind. That's what happens there. No, but anyway, the point is, how do we get here? How do we get here? Evolution. What's the purpose of life? There's not one. What happens when we die? You die. That's an atheist answer. Kind of bleak, but that's the answer. All right. So then you listen and you say, oh, and then we attack. No, weirdo. You don't attack. You might ask some clarifying questions to make sure you understand what they've said. But at this point, you're just letting them talk. And you're really showing them that you want to understand what they're saying. You
are pretending very well to care.
That's not the right way to do this. You're not pretending. You're trying to understand. Yeah. And then after you think you understand, you get it, what they're basically saying, that brings you to step number two. Step number two is where you say,
that's stupid.
No, that is not what you do. That is not what you do. Step number two is where you say, would you mind now explaining to me what you understand the Christian message to be? Now, you may hear them say, well, there's over 1,000 different brands of Christianity and all these kind of things. And you might agree. So, yeah. But there's Orthodox Christianity. I just want to know basically what you understand the Christian message to be. Now, why would you ask them to explain to you Christianity?
To make sure they actually understand what they reject.
That's right.
And almost always they don't.
Right.
Because what you're going to end up saying after they explain to you what they think Christianity is, you're going to say, yeah, I don't believe that either.
Right. So
because you won't. Because what they'll say is, well, God created a bunch of people to make him happy, to give him a bunch of glory so that even though that they all sinned or whatever, if you're good enough, you'll go to heaven.
And get 72 virgins.
Yeah. Well,
or something.
But they'll say, but God wanted a bunch of slaves, so he created a bunch of people, and he wants them to worship him no matter how much evil he causes in the world. And then he sent Jesus to, he killed his own son out of cosmic child abuse, and it's, he raised zombie Jesus from the dead. And if you're good enough and you believe in this stuff, then you get to go to heaven while decent people go to hell. decent people who think it's okay,
to think and reason.
Be free thinkers, and decent people who don't
But
interfere with my sex life.
but-
They have to go to hell because they don't believe in your God who doesn't like premarital sex.
But
that's exactly what you'll hear.
We do actually have some atheist listeners, and they may be thinking right now, and they would be right, that that is a kind of person. That's mostly your internet atheist types. Yes. But there is a category of atheists who will actually try to answer that question. I mean, most of them in America, especially in the American South, were in evangelical families at some point, right?
Yes, so, Dr. John Mark Reynolds likes to say that most atheist free-thinking chapters were started by sons of Southern Baptist preachers.
Because they knew how to start a small group, right? but the thing is, some of them will get it right. Some of them are genuinely trying to give you what you're asking for and what they think you believe, but they will get something like the works-based salvation part wrong. Like they'll say you do enough good works and it'll merit you salvation. Right?
Well, most of them will get the you believe in Jesus part, but you have to do all of this other stuff too.
Yeah, but the point is, whatever they get wrong, if they get something wrong, you do something here. You've let them talk for 2 whole sections now. Now, at this point, if they got something wrong, you say, you know what? You're absolutely right. There is a Christianity, something called Christianity, that is like that. But I reject that too, like he said. I reject that along with you because that's not the Christianity I hold to. So now we're not talking past each other anymore. And if you need to, you explain to them what you understand the Christian message to be, or clarify.
Now, this is where it helps for you to actually know what it is yourself.
Right. That's right.
so
now, in a rare moment when the moons align, the planets align, occasionally, it's happened to me once, you'll have someone, once they properly understand the Christian message, that's all it takes. They're in. Like there won't be any more need to discuss. Like oh wow, well I didn't understand that. Yeah, that makes more sense.
And just as I am,
tell me more about that.
In the middle of,
just as I am without one plea.
It comes out of your phone.
Yeah, and you have an altar call. No, honestly, sometimes that's all it takes, and someone comes to Christ,
right?
Or at least wants to talk. Doesn't want to talk about the same
just
stuff.
Because, and you know what, it has just as much to do with what you said as it does the fact that you were willing to have the awkward conversation and listen to them and not fake it.
Yeah.
So, you're a Christian and you don't want this to happen to me.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes that goes a long way too.
Yeah.
And notice that you're just talking to people. This is not, we can call it cumulative case or normative or conversational apologetics, but really you're talking to people because you love them. That's all it is.
Yep.
And you're sharing the gospel after you let them tell you what they think it is.
Yep. Amen.
Now, my question is, though...
Now, that's only steps 1 and 2. There's more,
right.
But go ahead.
But what happens, what's next if you get the person who gets the former Southern Baptist, who gets everything about Christianity right?
Then you say, that great, then you understand Christianity, and now I understand your worldview, because that's not, you're not trying to trap them. You want them to get to that point, and if they're already there, that just made your job easier. It didn't make it harder; it made it easier.
Yeah, but
because
we need to tell
now,
people this.
because now we're not talking past each other. Okay,
and which means you can remind them when they stray from that and try to issue in a straw man. No, as you already say, you know better than
you knew that's not what Christianity holds. No, right. Okay, so that's that. Now, if they don't get saved all of a sudden, which, again, that is really rare. Okay, that's the black swan out there that rarely ever gets seen. Okay, now then we move on to step 3. Step 3, and remember, you're not going to say to them, okay, now step 1. Yeah, this is all happening like
this is just the way the conversation progresses.
Right. So then step number 3 is...
Or phase 3.
You
so
say,
it's not a step.
Phase 3 is you say to them now... Okay, now this is where you may get a little confused with me explaining this, and they may get a little confused with you asking for this. But what you want to do is you want to say, what are some things that you and I both believe are true, both of us believe are true about the way the world is, that you think your worldview makes sense of, that my worldview doesn't make sense of. Okay? Now think about what I'm asking. I'm asking for facts, data, about the way our world is, that their naturalistic worldview, they think that makes sense of that, and Christianity doesn't make sense.
Remember, the conversation is centered around protology, teleology, and eschatology. So what they're going to say is, Christianity doesn't make sense of evolution. Evolution is true, is what they'll say. Everyone believes in evolution now except for you Christians. Evolution's true, and Christianity doesn't explain evolution because this wonderful good God wouldn't be so wasteful. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't have mucked about so poorly with this. If God was actually intending to design, if design was true, it would have been a lot more efficient and better. So I don't think your Christianity, Dr. Hunter, can account for evolution.
Okay, so now there's a couple of things to say here. First of all, what I thought you were going to say, and what you will hear, is someone try to go talking about evolution, and you said something more than that I'm going to come back to and address. But if someone just starts talking about, well, evolution, we know evolution happened, therefore my worldview makes sense.
Everyone knows evolution is true.
If they go that way, then what you can do, you may not want to do this, depending on how where your interests are. But this is what you should do: is you should say,
Answers in Genesis has all the answers.
Well, you could say that. You could say that. But you could say, that's a very interesting discussion about evolution. But there are a lot of Christians that actually do believe in evolution. And so what I'm more interested in talking to you about is the good reasons to believe that the Christian God, my worldview, which is that there's a Christian God who exists, doesn't make sense of. There are a lot of Christians who think that the Christian God makes sense of evolution. So evolution wouldn't count in favor of your worldview, in favor of my worldview. It would just be a thing.
But evolution is so many billions of years later. You want to talk about evolution? Let's talk about cosmic evolution. Let's go back to the very beginning. Forget about how human life
Is this you responding to him?
Yeah, is what I would say. It's like, evolution is too soon. It's too. Let's go back a little bit further, because there wouldn't even be evolution if there wasn't a cosmos from which life could evolve on a planet that eventually evolved from a cosmos that came into being from what looks like to most scientists that aren't pretending to live in the Sliders movie. It came from nothing. So let's talk about that. Let's not talk about how we got here. Let's talk about how everything got here.
Well, but now you've asked him to give you a piece of data.
Yeah.
Now that's good. Because what you want to do is get to a point where you can just have a conversation.
Yeah, and I say, what I say? I say evolution is one of many possible ways of human life coming to be that Christians believe. So.
But the point is, I liked what you said originally. Now, you said something better as role-playing as an atheist here. You didn't just say evolution is true, and my worldview accounts for that, and yours doesn't. If that was all you said, I could say, well, no, there are a lot of Christians who believe in evolution, regardless of whether I do or not.
Oh, but that God was so
sloppy. But then you said the universe is, if it's designed, it's sloppy design.
Right.
The evolution, God wouldn't have done it that way.
Right.
Okay. So now that's saying more, and so he's right, I would have to respond to that. How does my worldview make sense of that? And at that point, I could point out that, okay, first of all, if you're saying something is poorly designed, say that again really slowly. It's poorly designed, right? Right? Like when I was in my first debate in Miami, there was a bunch of Cubans there. People had come over from Cuba, and they had a car in Cuba that they told me about called the Fatingo. And the reason it was called that was it was the first automatic transmission automobile in Cuba. Ford Motor Company put it there, and they called it the foot dash N, the letter N dash go, because they wanted to emphasize you just put your foot down and go. You didn't have to change gears. And so it's called a Fatingo. They started calling it a Fatingo, right? Everybody knew this was like the worst designed automobile Ford ever made and the worst designed automobile in Cuba. But nobody questioned that this automobile is designed, right? Yeah. So you can talk about whether the design is good or not, but you're talking about design. Beyond that, Christians actually have a really good explanation of why the universe has this appearance of design, but could in certain cases seem seem like it's not as good as it could be. First of all, I don't know what a perfectly designed cosmos even means. What does that even mean? Because no matter what you make it, you could make it perfect in a subjective sense by saying, could have had more flowers or something, you know?
Yeah, you could always add one more whatever
Right.
to make it
So
even better.
so there's that. But second, Christians
You'd have to be God, omniscient, to know what perfection is, which
Right.
means you would just duplicate God, and there can't be two identical Yahweh.
Right.
There can't be two gods, so you can never have anything perfect.
Right.
And God never.
maximal is what we want.
Right.
Now, was this world maximal at one point? Well, this is great because on Christian theology, it certainly was. It was even old Earth people can hold this. It was maximal at some point, but there was a fall, and because of that fall, the
But it
world
was
is
never
not what it
perfect.
once
It was
was.
maximal.
It was maximal, right? So, can Christians explain that piece of data that he throws out? Yes, they perfectly well. First of all, we're not sure that is a piece of data, right? And we want to point that out.
Right.
But even if it is, we can account for that data.
But what his argument is not that, there seems to be a design, but that if it was designed, it's bad.
It wouldn't be like, okay, now we could say something else about that. We could say, all right, now what you're doing is you're doing what we could call divine psychology. And what I mean by that is you're psychoanalyzing the God that you don't believe exists and asking and saying, this God that I don't believe exists, if he did exist, I know what he would do because I know all about him and he would do it this way. that doesn't follow at all, right? So the point is you can have that kind of conversation about that piece of data. So that piece of data doesn't count in favor of naturalism. All right. So another thing can you think of anything else that might?
Well, you'd also say what William Lane Craig said to Frank Zwindler or whatever in that debate that happened in the 90s. That's at Willow Creek. I think that was the opponent, where he said, "Oh, by the way, this is so improbable that life could evolve that it would require an absolute miracle of God to make evolution even go."
Yeah, you could argue that if evolution is true, it's evidence for God.
Right.
I just recently heard David Wood say something really good about that. I'm going to get it wrong, so don't quote these numbers. But
By the way, neither one of us
something
believe in
like
it. We're not theistic evolutionists, so I don't
right.
know.
So he
But
says,
we will say, for the sake of argument, things that say no. That doesn't give you anything. So.
Right. So I think there's 10 to the 80th power atoms in the physical universe, and the interactions necessary to get life to the level that it is right now is something like 10 to the 120th power, which means you couldn't have that number in the amount of time that evolution has been going on evolution. And so if it got there, the way it got there would have to be designed.
Right.
Right. So, but anyway, these are all things you could say. Can you think of anything else? Now, remember, a piece of data that we agree and they agree is true about the way the world is, that makes sense on naturalism, they think, that does not make sense on Christianity.
Because because you're not capitulating that evolution is true. You're just capitulating that even if it were, it's not a point in your favor.
Right, yeah. We're not... Actually, that's a good point. I'm not sure I would grant him that data point because I've asked him for something we both agree is true about the way the world is. And he didn't necessarily, if I'm not an evolutionist, give me something that we both agree is true.
Right.
But because so many people do just take it for granted, I thought, okay, let's go there. And I went with it. Plus, I liked that you were role-playing with me. You don't do that very often. So when you... Thank God. So when you did, I decided to roll with it and defeat your silly argument. So, all right, what's another thing? I mean, that you're posing for the atheist.
Well, they would. Well, here's the tricky one. They would both agree, and this is actually so super easy for the theist. But, they used to not agree with this, but there is an objective morality. They figured out that they look ridiculous when they affirm relativism, so now they affirm objective morality. A lot of atheists, they're heroes. If they're an internet atheist, or they're watching these internet atheists, and these internet atheists are saying, yeah, morality is objective now. Because they realized how horrible they looked by copping up to relativism. That's really what I think.
So are you saying they might present to me
as
we
a both
piece
agree
of data?
we both agree that morality is objective.
You know, it's funny you say
Killing
this.
people is bad. And used to be atheists were moral relativists, most often. Mm-hmm. But because they would get destroyed and made to look ridiculous, they couldn't sell that. This is what I literally believe why they changed tactics.
Okay.
So now they all argue for objective morality. Have you noticed this?
Yeah. Well,
Right.
not
A
all
form
of
of
them do,
it.
but some of them do. Yeah,
More and more
do now.
The ones that engage with Christians because they're tired of walking around saying rape is okay because that's what they look like when they leave, right? Everyone in there, including the atheists, are thinking that guy thinks it's okay to rape babies. And so...
Hey, we got a new subscriber.
Yeah. So,
James Henry.
So because the atheists who debate Christians are tired of looking like they celebrate the rape of children, they have changed their tactic, and they all agree with objective morality, just not God is not necessary for that. Humans are necessary for that.
Okay, but...
So we agree that
It's funny that you actually bring that, because there's an episode of Don Johnson's old radio show. You got to find it deep in his archives, where an atheist actually says what you just said. He says, "Well, objective morality, Christianity can't make sense of that. Naturalistic atheism can't." What? Like, even if I were somehow to grant you that you could have objective morality without God, which I don't believe, how in the world are you telling me Christianity can't account for that? So no, you're right. They bring that up.
Okay, so the atheist says, or the skeptic says, we both agree that it is absolutely wrong to murder a human being.
Okay. To murder.
Yeah, it's wrong to commit murder. It's wrong to kill innocent life.
I agree.
I agree with you, Christian. That's one area we agree on. So why does Christianity make better sense of it's bad to kill? We don't need the Ten Commandments to know that it's bad to kill.
No. You don't need the Ten Commandments necessarily to know that it's wrong to kill. But this is to confuse your framework of knowledge as it relates to morality, which we could call moral epistemology, with the actual foundation as the ontology of morality. We're not saying, and by the way, this is something that they get wrong all the time. We're not saying that you don't have. We're not saying that you're not aware or that you can't be good people. Now there are Christians who say that, and they shouldn't say that. You can be good people, care about your kids as much as I care about my kids, help little old ladies across the street and little old men, so we're not sexist. I mean, you can do all those kind of things to help people and be a good person. We're not saying you're not aware. In fact, we think the fact that you are aware is evidence that.
Now, I believe it's bad to kill people. I think it's bad to murder people. You think it's objectively wrong to murder people. You think because God said so means that it's bad. When I can say, no, it's just a brute fact about reality in the framework of human existence that if you look around, it brings misery. So I don't need God to
It is a brute
objective.
fact. I agree with you that it is a brute fact that when you do things that Christians call evil, it's bad for it causes
It's what everyone
suffering.
calls evil.
Okay, fine. So do Christians. And it causes suffering. I agree. I'm saying that you don't have any foundation to say that that is actually a good or a bad thing. You don't have a foundation. You can say it's bad or it's good because I don't like it, or people don't like it, or people don't like to suffer and die, but you have no justification for saying that that is an objectively good or bad thing.
Sure, I do. It's a brute fact about the fabric of reality.
Well, that's just an assertion. It has no explanatory power.
Neither does God.
Well, sure it does. Because if you
hear
have
it.
Okay, first I'll give you a couple of reasons.
Let them hear it.
Now, by the way, audience, what he's posing now is what you would call non-natural moral realism. Now, this is someone who wants to say,
This is someone who wants to type essays on our YouTube comment channel.
This is someone
that you should never read.
This is someone who wants to say objective morality is real, just like the Christian thinks it is, but it doesn't find its foundation in God. It just is. And that's all there is to it. And they would say, to be fair to them, they would say to posit God and then say God is a necessary being who requires no explanation is just to kick it back down the street further than it has to. Morality just is, and it is necessarily. There's a couple of problems with this. First of all, God, so defined, is a being whose nature could serve as a foundation. Just to say morality just floats around and it just is, doesn't explain anything. Second, it's got an interesting telos to it. Yeah. It seems to be, number one, only really specific to human beings, which is interesting. You know, when a lion chases down a gazelle and rips it to shreds, we don't say it murdered the gazelle, we say it killed the gazelle. When animals engage in forced copulation, we don't say they raped, we say they engaged in forced copulation, which is actually good for the survival of their species. So the moral terms, murder and rape, are specific to humans, because it seems like there's some design in it. It seems to be for human beings. It seems to be something that's for us and not for other animals. And if you say, well, but that's how we survive and all that sort of thing, well, tell that to the lion who's killing the gazelle. I mean, it's interesting that these things would come to us.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a design to it. So I don't think that the non-natural moral realism of just saying we just believe it by magic answers the question.
Or that we found it by magic.
Yeah.
You know, it's not something you can. Morality is not one among the things that you can touch, taste, smell.
Right. So they'll mention these sorts of things. That's a rare one to get, but I have heard it come up. They'll often say science
I'm not
works.
giving you the low-hanging fruit. We expect more from you, Dr. Hunter, to answer the tough ones.
Well, have I answered? Have I risen to the occasion?
Yeah, but I mean, it's also easy to say. Just say. It's just you answered it because everything is answerable. Because stuff like that, even what sounds good, it just is. And surely you agree with me, it just is.
Right.
How is it just is?
I don't have to know.
I don't. Who knows? Who cares? It's
But
somewhere. It's somewhere in the quarks.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing with all this. You just said something. I don't even think you know how brilliant what you just said was.
I always know.
The thing is, anything they bring that is truly a fact about the way the world is, that we agree with them, that is a fact about the nature of reality, that they want to say makes sense on naturalistic atheism that does not make sense on Christianity, or on Islam that doesn't make sense on Christianity, or Hinduism that doesn't make sense on Christianity. If it really is a fact about the world, it will make sense on Christianity. Christianity does have an explanation for it because Christianity is true.
And it may or may not make, let's be fair, it may or may not make sense on naturalism, but it will always make sense on Christianity. And, oh, by the way, when you move on from that one issue or the two examples and you start piling up these issues, the disparity between who can account for the preponderance of evidence goes up in the favor of Christianity, because you have to do your homework, but if you study these things, at some point they're just living in denial. They're just nope for the sake of nope. Maybe.
Well, and here's the thing. Most people you're going to talk to are not going to be like internet atheists. This is your friend. This is the guy you work with. This is the girl you go to school with. This is whatever. And they aren't versed in Matt Dillahunty internet atheism, okay? They're just people. They're normal people. And they're not going to have much to say, really, most of the time when you ask them for facts about the way the world is that make sense on naturalistic atheism, that don't make sense on Christianity, because they haven't. But even the ones that have thought about these things aren't used to thinking in those terms. They're used to thinking about big arguments one way or the other. And you're asking them to do something a little more realistic than that. Okay,
but you're also asking them to do a little bit personal, too, because you're saying, what do you think are the answers to these questions? And so it's unless they are reading goofy atheist websites and memes and stuff, and give these, chances are they have thought about these things, and if you're training yourself in apologetics, you're probably doing more work than they are reading atheist memes or not. And so don't come off smug and like me, like where you're going to start, don't come off too smug when they stop being able to give answers.
Yeah.
But what you will find is that they will stop being able to give explanations that actually account for what they think their worldview can account for.
Yeah.
And charity, in fact, sometimes you want to say, well, what people like you normally believe is, you can even help them out a little bit. Yeah. But here's why I don't agree with even that. Yeah. And you tell them their side that you would normally, person like you would think this X, Y, and Z, but here's why I reject X, Y, and Z and why I'm still over here. And see, your worldview just can't come up to it, so why don't you, believe the gospel?
Yeah.
Where you're older.
Whenever somebody starts not being able to answer, you don't declare victory. That's when you start getting even more friendly. And you kind of see, and this is why I think this makes sense. I think you're kind of seeing it now too. You want to be a friend to them, and you're on their team, and you want them to know that you're on a team. I once heard this guy who is a professional Monopoly player.
That's a thing.
Say, when I play Monopoly, you're not my wife anymore. You're not my kids anymore. You're not my neighbor anymore. I am out for blood. But he's like, that's the only way to win Monopoly. But he said, in reality, one thing I've learned is, if you want to win, you need to be the kind of person that other people don't mind losing to.
Yeah.
And I think that is so helpful in apologetic discussions because whether or not you're thinking of it as a competition or a debate, they might be. And if they are thinking that way, you at least want to be the kind of person they don't mind losing to. Because you want to be that friend that they even maybe kind of want to learn to talk about these things like you're talking about them. So anyway, another thing they might bring up is the problem of evil. We have whole shows on the problem of evil, so we're not going to go into that. But they only bring up 2 or 3 things, usually. And you answer those, you talk to them. It may be a long conversation like we've just had here, role-playing it. But then what you want to do is move to that final stage. You say, look, we've talked about your stuff for a while. And I found it very interesting, and I hope that my responses have been helpful or at least reasonable to you.
Or at least that you're as interested in what I have to say as I am with what you have to say.
Hey, that's a good thing to say. Yeah. It's pretty good. So then the next phase 4, is where you say...
There's a line to sell while you're faking it.
If it's I'm not faking it. I am interested. Then the 4th phase is, is it all right with you if I share with you some things that I think... that my Christian worldview accounts for, that your naturalistic atheistic worldview, I don't think really accounts for that well. Can I share those things with you? If they say no, that's okay. Don't force it, okay? But they usually, now that you've let them talk basically for 3 phases, then now they're invested enough, they kind of have to let you talk. And they might be interested. So you share with them your reasons. We say, what are the reasons? I don't know, you think about it. But we've listed a whole bunch of them here. Why is it that there is morality in the world? Why is it that we know that certain things are right or wrong? What about beauty? Why is it? This is one you don't hear in apologetics very often.
Why is Pritchett Prime so objectively beautiful to everybody?
Why is it that bald men are objectively more beautiful than men with hair? Why is that? No, those are actually more, some people would say very subjective, but or objectively unattractive. But the thing is, it does.
Yeah, but you could say, why are roses universally recognized as beautiful, and why is a puddle of vomit typically viewed as gross?
Or why? Now they will actually have answers to these things to say, well, things like a flower or a waterfall are beautiful because during our process of evolution, we recognized in early primate development that being a waterfall represents a water source, which means survival, and a flower represents fruit probably nearby, which is life and stuff. They'll have things they can say, but you're doing worldview comparison. What makes more sense of this? Yeah. And another thing would be free will. Did you know that on your naturalistic atheism, free will is impossible? But on our worldview, it is possible. And so you talk about that for a little bit. Why is it that you have the rapid expansion of the early church? That seems to make more sense if Jesus rose from the dead. What about these near-death experiences? I mean, we talked about that 2 or 3 episodes ago on the show, but that's a good point because that's something you both agree that you're not. He may not agree with you or she that people are actually having these experiences or that these experiences are supernatural, but he can't deny that these are reported in medical journals, blah, blah, blah. So you can talk about that. There's all kinds of things. You could talk about the stuff that a classical apologist might talk about. God's the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. God's the best explanation for the design of the universe. God's the best explanation for the morality that we experience. All these kinds of things. And really what's going to happen is, one thing you can do is if you just lay all that stuff out all at once, I want to talk about these things, and you lay out like 10 things. They say, now let's go through them one by one. They're going to be impressed by the force of the amount of data. And what they don't know is that as many physical objects or concepts are in the physical universe could be added to that list because everything in a cumulative case, everything imaginable could be used as a data point to show that Christianity is true, or at least that God exists. So that's how you do it. And then you just have that conversation. Now, let me back off as an evangelistic apologist and front this with something else. When you're explaining to them, or when you're letting them explain to you the Christianity back in phase 2, one of the things that you want to emphasize if they don't is you want to emphasize to them the gospel message and what it means to be a Christian and how that happens.
Phase 2 is them asking you asking them what they think Christianity is.
Yes.
Yeah. That was an hour ago. So you need to...
So the reason is because now at the end, when you finally get to a point where you guys have talked about all this for a while, this would be a good point. You got to read the room, but this would be a good point to say, you know what? I think you're seeing that there's really good reason to believe this is true. Now I want to talk to you back about that Christian message that you explained to me a while ago, and I want to nuance it a little bit, and I want to start talking about that. Just be a person. I'm not giving you the words to say, but start moving it toward a gospel presentation, because that's how you can use cumulative case apologetics. And by the way, I really want you to get this. Maybe you're new to apologetics and you've shown up at apologetics315.com and seen this, or maybe you are a student at Trinity and you're just now getting into an apologetics. And some of what we've said sounds like what you don't even know what we were talking about. A couple of things. Number one, most people that you talk to in normal life, will not bring up things as complex as what we've discussed here. They're real people. They do other things for a living, and they don't know how to talk about these kind of things. So it'll be much more down to earth when you have this conversation than me reacting to Jonathan Pritchett's alter atheist ego. All right. And then second, if they do bring up something you don't know the answer to, you know what you do there? You've got a bulletproof vest that gets you out of this. You just say, you know what? That's a really good question. I don't know. You say, well, I can't admit that I don't know, because then they'll think, I don't know. You say, yeah, because I don't know, and that's a really good question, and that means I have an opportunity to go learn something, and that'll impress them.
And we can explore it together when I get done. I can go be an answer finder.
Yeah, be an answer finder.
We have a whole thing about
even if you
that.
can't be an answer giver, you can be an answer finder.
Yes, and it gives you an opportunity to have... Look, you don't... And here's another thing that I would say. Don't rush this. The goal is not to have them praying the sinner's prayer within an hour.
It'd be great.
It would be great. But that shouldn't be the goal.
And it has happened.
Yes, but your goal is not to time limit it, because you're investing in people.
Yeah. So I offer
Unless you're
this
faking it.
as a single encounter apologetic strategy, because you can do all this in one
And
encounter.
refresh
but
the
if
phrases,
it takes longer,
the
you can
phases.
take longer.
Yeah, and refresh the phases before we go.
Oh, yeah. So phase number one is you want to ask them how they understand the big questions of life. How do we get here? What's the purpose of life? And what happens when we die? And then phase number two, you ask them to explain Christianity to you. And if there are misunderstandings, you correct those misunderstandings. That allows us to not talk past each other. And then phase number three, you want to ask them to share with you facts about the world, pieces of data about the world that we both agree on, that their worldview makes sense of, that your Christian worldview does not make sense of. And then you do engage. You talk about those things and you respond from a Christian perspective. And then when that fizzles out, you move on to phase four, which is you ask if you can share with them things that your Christian worldview accounts for, that their worldview doesn't account for. And those will be a little bit specific based on the worldview, but that's okay. And then when that gets to a lull, then you kind of share the gospel. And if that happens the first day, that's great. If that happens 2 weeks in, that's great. But that is a way that you can do this that I think is really helpful and allows them to talk a lot and makes them cared for as a person.
And they're invested in you. Anyone who will listen to another person, they will invest in you whether they agree with your worldview or not, because so few people actually listen to others anymore. That's why
I'm so good at it. I listen to you so well.
You do, even when you're not interested. So, and here I will jump in front of a truck for this man who doesn't care what I say, but pretends
I do care.
very well.
No, I don't pretend
what I say.
No,
So,
I do care.
Yeah, but no, seriously though, this is a very personal investment kind of approach, and I think that it works. I think that it's probably the best form of evangelistic apologetics there is in personal evangelism or even group evangelism. I don't know that it would work well in other venues, but as far as evangelism goes, street evangelism, and maybe even in sermons, I think sermons, preachers could incorporate more of this, grabbing data points from the text.
Yeah, this is really good for that.
And weave that in as well.
Archaeological discoveries when you're talking about something.
Yeah. We've in data points in sermons, it works really well. But that's what most people aren't preachers. Most people aren't evangelists.
But they can be.
That's
If you'd
right.
like to study to be a preacher, an evangelist, an apologist, a counselor, or you're just an interested person who is not interested in professional ministry, visit our website at Trinitysem.edu, Trinitysem.edu, and you will never find a more cost-effective and flexible school. You do not have to come to the campus. You can do it 100% online. You don't even have to come for graduation, although we'd love to see you. And you can get, and because we don't operate on semesters, did you know? I don't think we highlight this enough. You can start today. You can call us today, and you can start studying to be whatever God has called you to be in a more educated way. And you can have people like Dr. Pritchett as a professor, and Dr. Leighton Flowers, and Dr. Steve Gregg. And so you want to do that. Now, if you like this podcast and you'd like to hear more from us, first of all, one thing you can do, in addition to listening by audio, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Braxton Hunter. That really helps us. Even if you don't watch regularly on the video, it really helps us. Also, click up here somewhere. This is our Patreon. If you'd like to consider prayerfully supporting our program, it will not heal your illnesses supernaturally. We will not send you prayer cloths, and we may spend that money on selfish personal things like lunch. So knowing all that, if you still want to give, we really appreciate that. And if you like to listen to the other episodes that are a part of our podcast consortium, the Trinity Commission, you can visit Soteriology 101 with Leighton Flowers, Steve Gregg's The Narrow Path, and Billy and Matt at the Bible Brodown. So
Billy
check those out.
Winland and Matt Chisholm. We hardly ever say their last names. It's Billy and Matt. But it's Billy Winland and Matt Chisholm, and if you search for them, you can find all of the Trinity Commission. We all have Facebook groups. Bible Brodown has a group or a page. We have a group and a page.
Yeah.
Narrow Path, Steve Gregg.
If you go to Facebook and look up Trinity Radio Prime Time Discussion.
Ours. That's the best one.
That's ours. And so do that. Hey, one thing that really helps us, I didn't realize this till recently, but if you rate and actually type a review on the iTunes page for the podcast.
As long as it's a good one.
Don't just ignore that I'm saying this if you don't like the show. But if you listen this long, you probably enjoy it. So
or fake it. Like
that
we were talking
really
about
here's what that does. That gets us into another category. When we have enough of those, it gets us into another category in iTunes where they promote us more, and then it gets the word out better. So these are things that don't cost you anything. Except for the Patreon, that does. But everything else doesn't cost you anything. Okay, so do that for us, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.
If you would like more content, click here and keep watching Bible studies. Click up here. And finally, we want you to subscribe. We need more subscribers, so click here.